Good evening, dear listeners, and a very warm welcome to you all, wherever you are tuning in from tonight. Maybe cozied up in bed, listening from your favorite quiet corner at home, or perhaps relaxing somewhere peaceful with the world fading away outside. I'm so glad you've joined me here. Take a slow, deep breath. Let your shoulders drop. Maybe pull the covers up a bit higher and feel the day gently slip away. Let the story begin. It was a foggy autumn night in Victorian London when a desperate violinist burst into 221 B Baker Street. His priceless Stradivarius lay smashed to pieces, and the famous conductor of the Imperial Theatre was found dead in the orchestra pit. The police called it a tragic accident. But Sherlock Holmes saw what others missed. A single mother-of-pearl fragment. A coded note that read, "The midnight violin will play no more," and footprints that told a darker story, jealousy, revenge, or something far more sinister hidden behind the glamour of the theatre. Within the hour, Holmes and Watson were plunged into a deadly game of forgery, international intrigue, and cold-blooded murder, where even the music itself had become a weapon. The game was truly afoot. Chapter 1. A Case presents itself. It was a chill autumn evening in London in the year 1894 when the yellow fog crept thick along Baker Street like a living thing. Coal smoke hung heavy and acrid on the tongue, mingling with the damp, earthy scent of fallen leaves and the faint, brackish whiff of the Thames. Gas lamps flickered weakly, their light reflecting off wet cobblestones that gleamed like polished leather. The air felt raw and cold against the skin, while inside 221B the fire crackled warmly, offering a welcome contrast. I had not seen Holmes so restless in weeks. He paced our sitting room, violin tucked under his chin, drawing out a melancholy air that echoed the city's uneasy hum, the rattle of hansom cabs on stone, the low murmur of voices from the street, and the occasional sharp whistle of a constable. Mrs. Hudson had just cleared away our simple supper of cold beef and pickles, the sharp taste of mustard still lingering pleasantly on my tongue. The bell rang below with unusual urgency. Heavy footsteps ascended the stairs, accompanied by the creak of worn wood and the rustle of a damp overcoat. Holmes paused mid-bow, his keen eyes gleaming with sudden interest. "A client, Watson," he said quietly, "and one in some distress, judging by that hurried tread." The door opened, to admit a tall, slender man in his early 30s. His evening dress was rumpled, with fresh mud staining the cuffs. His face was pale, framed by slightly disheveled dark hair, and he carried the faint scent of expensive Turkish tobacco mixed with stage makeup and nervous sweat. In his gloved hands, he clutched a small leather case, the material soft and well-worn from constant use. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he asked, his voice cultured, yet edged with strain. "I am Victor Langford, first violinist with the Imperial Theatre Orchestra. I come on a matter of the gravest urgency." Holmes gestured him toward the armchair by the fire, where the warmth contrasted sharply with the cooler corners of the room. "Pray be seated, Mr. Langford. This is my friend, Dr. Watson. You may speak freely before us both." Langford sank into the chair, the fabric sighing softly under his weight. He opened the leather case to reveal a beautiful violin. Its wood glowed with a rich, deep polish under the lamplight, the strings taut and gleaming. Yet the instrument was damaged. A long, thin crack ran along the belly, and the bridge was cruelly splintered. "Last night, after the performance of The Tempest at the Imperial Theatre," he began, "this violin, my Stradivarius, worth a king's ransom, was found smashed in my dressing room. But that is not the worst of it. Our conductor, Maestro Elias Voss, was discovered dead in the orchestra pit shortly after midnight. The police call it an accident, a fall from the podium during a moment of dizziness. But I know better. Voss was in perfect health. And there was this." He produced a crumpled note from his pocket, The paper was coarse and slightly damp, carrying a faint smell of fresh ink and cheap perfume. Holmes took it carefully between his long fingers and read the brief message aloud. "The midnight violin will play no more. Silence the maestro or face the music." Langford lit a cigarette with trembling hands. Blue smoke curled upward in the firelight. Voss had many enemies among the troupe. Jealousies run high in the theatre world. There is Madame Elena Rossi, the soprano, whose affair with Voss ended bitterly only last month. Then, young Thomas Reed, the second violinist, ambitious and hot-tempered. Our manager, Mr. Silas Crowe, argued fiercely with Voss over finances. Count Dmitry Orlov, a Russian patron, has shown unusual interest in our instruments of late. Even old Jenkins, the stagehand, muttered threats after Voss docked his wages. I confess I noticed nothing particularly unusual about the note at first, though perhaps you, dear reader, were more observant than I in those early moments. Holmes leaned forward, steepled his fingers, and studied the damaged violin closely. He turned it slowly under the lamp, examining the clean line of the crack. "This was not smashed in a fit of rage," he observed. "The damage is precise, a single, calculated blow from something narrow and hard. See the angle of the fracture?" I peered at the instrument, but saw only wreckage. "It tells you something important?" "It tells me the perpetrator is musical and methodical," Holmes replied. "I recall a similar affair in Manchester in '82 involving a stolen Guarneri. A rival had weakened the bridge with precise cuts so the instrument would collapse during performance. The wood remembers the intent, Watson, just as a man's boots or cuffs betray his true movements, despite any alibi. Here, the violin was sabotaged deliberately, perhaps to draw attention or to silence a witness. Langford's face grew even paler. "You believe Voss knew about the sabotage?" "Possibly," Holmes said. "Or the phrase midnight violin refers to something else entirely." We departed Baker Street within the hour. The hansom cab splashed through puddles as a light rain began to fall, cold droplets stinging our faces. The streets echoed with the cries of late-night vendors and the rumble of omnibuses. At the Imperial Theatre in Drury Lane, the gaslights still burned low, casting a warm yet eerie glow on the gilded facade. Inside, the air carried the mingled scents of grease paint, sawdust, and wilting flowers from the previous night's bouquets, sweet and slightly cloying against the sharper tang of machine oil from the stage machinery. Inspector Lestrade met us in the foyer, his bowler hat damp and his boots squeaking on the marble floor. "Holmes, I expected you might appear. Tragic accident, plain as day. The old fellow had a heart flutter and lost his balance. No need for your fancy methods here." Holmes offered a thin smile. "Perhaps, Lestrade. Yet Mr. Langford tells a different tale. Show us the orchestra pit." The pit lay dim and cool, below stage level. The wooden floorboards, worn smooth by countless feet and slightly sticky from spilled resin. The temperature dropped noticeably. Voss's body had been removed, but chalk marks outlined the position of his fall. A faint smell of brandy lingered near the podium. Holmes knelt and examined the steps with his lens. "Observe these scuff marks, Watson. They point downward with considerable force, not the slide of a dizzy man, but the result of a push." Lestrade snorted. "Any number of feet could have made those." "True," Holmes conceded, rising. "But combined with this." He pointed to a small fragment of mother-of-pearl embedded in the wood, part of an inlaid violin bow. "And the violin in Langford's room, smashed with violence, yet no one heard the noise during the quiet hours after the performance. Most curious." We moved on to the dressing rooms. Madame Rossi's chamber was fragrant with French perfume and face powder, silks draped softly over chairs. Reed's room was cluttered with sheet music, the paper crisp and smelling of fresh ink. Crowe's office held the musty odor of old ledgers and cigar ash. Orlov's private box carried a trace of Russian leather and strong black tea. In Langford's dressing room, Holmes lifted the damaged violin once more. The crack is too clean for random destruction. This was struck deliberately. The perpetrator knows instruments well. I failed to connect the details entirely at that moment. Perhaps you fared better with the fragments we had gathered. As we left the theatre, the fog had thickened again, muffling the sounds of the city to a distant murmur. The case had taken firm hold of Holmes. I could see it in his purposeful stride and the familiar gleam in his eye. Questions swirled in my mind. Who would destroy a priceless Stradivarius and kill a respected conductor in such a public place? The threatening note suggested blackmail or revenge, deeply tied to the glittering yet jealous world of the orchestra. Yet, as our cab rattled back toward Baker Street, through the damp streets, Holmes murmured softly, "The game is afoot, Watson, and it plays a far darker tune than any ever performed upon that stage." Chapter 2. Into London streets. The following morning dawned, grey and raw, a biting wind, carrying the metallic tang of impending rain mixed with the ever-present coal smoke from 1,000 chimneys. Holmes and I broke our fast with strong tea, its warmth welcome against the chill, and buttered toast whose crisp texture crunched pleasantly. Mrs. Hudson's footsteps echoed below, accompanied by the clatter of dishes and the low hum of the street, costermongers calling their wares, the steady clip-clop of horses' hooves on wet cobblestones. Our first call was to the fashionable terrace near Regent's Park, where Madame Eleanor Rossi resided. The drawing-room felt warm and luxurious, scented with jasmine perfume and fresh-cut roses whose petals felt soft and velvety. Rossi, a striking woman with dramatic dark eyes, received us in a silk dressing gown that whispered as she moved. "Voss, a brute," she declared, her Italian accent thick with feeling. "He promised me the lead in the new opera, then gave it to that young French girl." We argued, yes. But murder? I was at supper with friends after the show. Ask them if you doubt me. Holmes noted the slight tremor in her hand as she poured coffee, the liquid steaming hot. "And the violin, Langford's Stradivarius." She laughed, and a brittle sound against the soft ticking of a mantel clock. "Jealousy is common in our world, Mr. Holmes, but I do not smash instruments. I sing." Her eyes flickered briefly toward a small photograph of Voss on the mantel, the affectionate inscription now angrily crossed out. The paper of the photo felt smooth under Holmes's fingers when he examined it later. We next ventured into a narrow, grimy street off the Strand to the lodgings of young Thomas Reed. The air here hung heavy with the smell of boiled cabbage and damp plaster. The floorboards were uneven and creaked loudly underfoot. Reed, wiry and intense, was practicing scales on a lesser violin, the notes sharp and insistent amid the rumble of passing carts outside. "Ambition. Of course I have it," he admitted, wiping sweat from his brow. The room felt cool and clammy. Voss blocked my solos at every turn. But kill him. I was packing my music in the green room until 1 o'clock. Holmes examined a bow lying nearby, its horsehair textured and slightly frayed. "This bow shows recent repair. New hair added. Yet your hands bear no fresh calluses, consistent with heavy practice last night." Reed flushed. I borrowed Langford's for a moment. It slipped from my fingers. The interview with Silas Crowe took place at the theatre office. Amid the scent of ink and the rough texture of old account ledgers, the manager was portly, his waistcoat strained, his voice booming over the distant hammering of stagehands, sharp, rhythmic thuds echoing through the building. "Finances were tight," Crowe confessed, offering us cigars that carried a rich Havana aroma. Voss demanded higher pay for the entire orchestra. We clashed more than once, but an accident is convenient. No scandal for the theatre. Count Orlov received us at his elegant hotel near Piccadilly. The lobby was warm with the glow of polished brass and the comforting aroma of strong Russian tea and well-oiled leather armchairs. The Count, impeccably dressed in a fur-trimmed coat, spoke with a smooth accent. "I sponsor the arts, gentlemen. Voss was useful for introductions in society. The violin, a magnificent piece. I admired it openly." His hands were soft and unmarked by labour, yet he kept a small case of documents bearing official-looking seals close at hand. The paper crackled crisply when Holmes turned a page. Our final stop that day was the modest, shabby rooms of old Jenkins in the East End slums. The air reeked of cheap gin, unwashed clothes, and the sour tang of the nearby river. Jenkins was grizzled, his hands rough and calloused like sandpaper. "Voss cut my wages for so-called laziness," he growled. The room cold and draughty, with wind whistling through cracked windows. I told him he'd regret it, but I was home by 11, asleep in my bed. Consider the facts as we knew them then. The smashed Stradivarius with its strangely precise damage, the musical threat in the note, Voss's fall with scuff marks suggesting force rather than accident, and 5 individuals each with clear opportunity after the curtain fell, and motives ranging from jealousy and ambition to money and revenge. The broken watch on Voss's wrist had stopped at midnight, matching Langford's discovery of the ruined violin. And mud on several pairs of shoes carried the same mixture of theatre stage dirt and London street grime. 3 men and 2 others had been backstage that night. I set down these details precisely as we gathered them. The reader may draw their own conclusions. Evidence continued to accumulate as we moved through the day. Holmes collected small samples, fibres from the pit steps and a flake of varnish from the violin, tucking them carefully into crisp envelopes. At a nearby music hall, we heard whispered rumours over pints of bitter ale, its malty taste warming, while raucous laughter and a bawdy song rose from the stage. The air was thick with pipe smoke and the sweet stickiness of spilled beer. In a quiet moment back at Baker Street, Holmes paced the sitting room, the smooth floorboards creaking softly beneath his feet. The fire cast flickering shadows as the temperature inside remained comfortably warm against the growing chill outside. "Multiple threads, Watson," he said, "yet one will surely lead to the centre of this dark melody." And questions multiplied as evening fell and the fog returned, bringing its damp chill once more. The distant toll of Big Ben sounded muffled through the mist. The glittering world of the orchestra clearly hid far more than simple rivalries. It whispered of debts, secret affairs, and perhaps something even darker tied to the valuable instruments themselves. Chapter 3. Deeper Waters. We returned to the Imperial Theatre the next afternoon as a light drizzle fell, cool droplets mixing with the brackish scent of the Thames carried on the breeze from the river. The stage was alive with rehearsal sounds, scraping violins, though a soprano's rising scales, and the rhythmic thud of boots on wooden boards. The air smelled of fresh paint, sawdust, and the faint resinous tang of rosin, while the temperature inside felt warmer than the damp street outside. Holmes insisted on re-examining the orchestra pit. He descended the steps carefully, the wood cool and slightly damp under our feet. "Observe this, Watson," he said, pressing his lens close. A single, dark, coarse hair caught on a splinter. Clearly, not from Voss's head. And here, a trace of resin powder mixed with something finer, almost like face powder. The significant evidence emerged when we inspected the locked instrument storage room behind the stage. Langford's spare bow lay on a shelf, its tip chipped in a distinctive way. Holmes compared it directly to the mother-of-pearl fragment we had found embedded in the pit steps. "A perfect match," he murmured. "The bow was used to strike the violin. But why?" Inspector Lestrade joined us, grumbling about wasted time, his boots leaving wet prints on the stone floor. The air grew cooler and mustier in the storage room, heavy with the smell of old wood and leather cases. Holmes's reasoning unfolded naturally in the green room, where the temperature rose again and the scent of fresh coffee mingled with cigarette smoke. "The hair is from a wig. Stage makeup, no doubt," Ned, the fall was no accident. Those scuff marks show a brief but violent struggle. Voss was pushed after confronting someone about the violin sabotage. The note's wording, midnight violin, refers not merely to the instrument, but perhaps to a coded signal or a planned handoff during the quiet hours after the performance. I did not understand then, though I fancy some readers have already guessed the deeper connection to the theatre's hidden dealings. He continued in his calm, conversational manner. It reminds me of the business with the counterfeit Stradivarius in Brighton some years ago. A forger had weakened genuine instruments with precise cuts to pass off clever fakes at auction. The seller used similar damage to test authenticity without obvious breakage. The forger's hands always bore traces of arcane varnish and glue, much as our culprit here has left fibers and powder. The world of rare instruments is small and cutthroat, Watson. A man's entire livelihood can hang on a single bowstroke or a perfect note. Complications arose swiftly when a telegram arrived for Madame Rossi during rehearsal. It read, "Your high notes will be silenced next." She grew hysterical, her French perfume suddenly cloying in the confined space as she clutched the paper with trembling fingers. Count Orloff appeared unexpectedly agitated, claiming diplomatic protection if questioned further about his movements that night. Young Reed produced an alibi witness, a barmaid from a nearby public house, whose testimony carried the smell of ale and cheap scent when we later spoke with her. The past case reference lingered as Holmes explained further while we rode in a hansom cab toward the docks, where a new lead pointed to a shady instrument dealer. But the Brighton forger was caught because he overlooked the unique grain in the wood. Each violin tells its own story, much like footprints in fresh mud or the wear on a man's cuffs. The ground and the instrument remembers every touch. New understanding began to dawn as we stood by the Thames warehouses later that evening. The water lapped coldly against the stone quays, and the air hung heavy with the sharp smell of tar, fish, and wet rope. A recently arrived crate of imported instruments had been opened, revealing one that closely matched descriptions of pieces suspected in recent forgeries. The labels felt slightly too crisp, the varnish a shade too uniform under Holmes's magnifying glass. The net of suspicion tightened around the orchestra, yet plausible red herrings remained. Reed's quick temper, Rossi's passionate outbursts, Crow's financial worries, and Jenkins's grumbled threats all seemed believable in the competitive, glittering world of the theatre. Yet the truth, I sensed, lay deeper than mere jealousy or personal grudges. It touched on forgery, profit, and perhaps even international intrigue connected to Count Orlov's frequent travels and mysterious patrons. The drizzle continued as we returned to Baker Street, the rain cool on our faces and the city sounds muffled once more. A clearer picture was forming, but many shadows still remained. Chapter 4, Shadows and Suspicions. The next 2 days took us through a whirlwind of short investigations across London, each scene revealing new layers of suspicion while the autumn chill deepened. We began at a smoky music hall in Leicester Square, where the air was thick with gin, sweat, and the sweet stickiness of spilled ale. A raucous song blared from the stage as a chorus girl named Kitty, her dress rustling with cheap sequins, leaned close over a small table. "I saw young Reed arguing hotly with Voss backstage after the curtain," she said, her breath warm with gin. Reed was red-faced, shouting about solos and credit. Voss laughed at him. It was just before midnight. Holmes noted the faint powder on her gloves, soft and slightly greasy to the touch. The music hall's heat contrasted sharply with the cold draft from the open door. Our second stop was a noisy factory near the railways in Whitechapel. The clang of machinery and the hot metallic smell of molten iron filled the air as we spoke with Jenkins's brother, a burly foreman whose hands were rough with calluses. The floor vibrated under our feet from the pounding hammers. "Jenkins was here with me until well after 1, the man insisted. wiping sweat from his brow. He didn't leave the East End that night. The alibi seemed solid, clearing old Jenkins for the moment and sending us back into the streets where the rumble of trains mixed with the distant cries of street vendors. Next, we visited a small hospital in Marylebone, where Madame Rossi claimed she had gone to see a sick aunt. The corridors smelled of carbolic acid and starch, the sheets crisp and cool under our fingers. The matron confirmed Rossi's visit, but noted the soprano had left shortly before midnight, leaving just enough time for her to return to the theatre. Rossi's soft leather gloves, when we later examined them at her home, he showed faint, dark stains that smelled faintly of stage resin and mud. She grew defensive when Holmes pointed them out, her perfume sharp in the warm drawing room. In Hyde Park, under grey skies and the soft rustle of damp leaves, we observed Count Orlov from a distance. He met a foreign-looking man on a quiet path, their conversation low and urgent. The grass felt wet and springy underfoot, and the cold wind carried the earthy scent of the park mixed with Orlov's Russian leather cologne. The man handed over a small packet before they parted quickly. Silas Crow's gambling debts surfaced at a discreet club near Pall Mall. The air was warm with the rich aroma of brandy and cigar smoke, the cards shuffling softly on green baize tables. A waiter whispered that Crow had lost heavily the week before and had argued with Voss about advancing theatre funds to cover his losses. A near miss added sudden tension. As Langford left the theatre one evening, a carriage rattled dangerously close, its wheels thundering on the cobblestones and the horse's breath hot and steaming in the cold air. Langford leapt aside just in time, his coat brushing the rough stone wall. Holmes examined the wheel marks later, fresh and deep in the mud. 3 men had clear opportunity after the show that night. 3 carried strong motives tied to money, position, or passion. Reed with his ambition, Crow with his debts, Orlov with his mysterious dealings. Which would you suspect most strongly? I confess I was lost among the shifting shadows and conflicting stories. False leads multiplied, and Jenkins's alibi held firm. Yet his brother's rough hands matched the texture of the stage ropes. Rossi's hospital visit left a window of time, her perfume still lingering in my memory. Orlov's packet might have been innocent, or something far darker. Crow's financial troubles explained his anger, but not the precise damage to the Stradivarius. The net seemed to be closing slowly around the orchestra. Yet Holmes remained enigmatic, his eyes gleaming in the gaslight as we rode between locations. The city's sounds, clattering hooves, distant bells, and the low murmur of crowds accompanied every step. The temperature dropped noticeably as evening fell. The fog beginning to creep back with its damp, choking presence and the sharp taste of coal smoke on the tongue. Each suspect had woven a plausible tale, and but small inconsistencies remained. A mismatched callus, a stained glove, a secretive meeting, a financial desperation. Tension built steadily as another anonymous note arrived at the theatre. The music will stop for all of you soon. The shadows of suspicion deepened, and the true melody of the case felt closer than ever, yet still just out of reach. Chapter 5. The pursuit night had fallen thick and cold over the London docks when the chase began. A thin mist rose from the Thames, carrying the sharp smell of salt, tar, and rotting fish. The temperature had dropped sharply, making our breath visible in the damp air as Holmes and I hurried along the wooden warehouses. Rough planks creaked under our boots, slippery with moisture, while distant foghorns moaned low and mournful across the water. A shadowy figure had been spotted slipping away from the theatre after another threatening note. Langford had identified the man as one of the stagehands who sometimes worked for Orlov. We pursued him through the maze of docks, the sounds of lapping waves, creaking ship rigging, and the occasional shout of sailors echoing around us. "Quickly, Watson!" Holmes urged, his voice low but urgent. The game was truly afoot now. The man broke into a run, his footsteps pounding on the wet wood. We followed, the cold wind cutting through our coats. He darted between towering crates that smelled of fresh timber and machine oil. then leaped onto a moored barge. The deck felt unsteady beneath us, rocking gently with the river's swell. Holmes leapt after him with surprising agility, his long coat flapping. I drew my revolver, then the metal cold and heavy in my hand as the thug turned to face us. He swung a heavy wooden spar, the air whistling as it passed close to Holmes's head. Holmes dodged, then closed in, grappling with the man. The two struggled on the deck, the wood rough and splintered against their boots. I heard the thud of fists and the sharp grunt of pain. "Watson!" "The rope!" Holmes called. I seized a coil of coarse hemp rope, its fibers biting into my palms, and helped secure the struggling man. His breath reeked of cheap tobacco and gin. As we subdued him, Holmes searched his pockets and pulled out a small packet wrapped in oilskin. Inside were several photographic negatives, the chemicals giving off a sharp, acrid scent when Holmes held them to the lantern light. Key evidence had been found. The negatives showed close-up images of violin labels being carefully altered, old masters' names replaced with forged signatures. One image even captured a hand wearing a distinctive ring matching Orlov's. Holmes examined the negatives closely under the swaying lantern, the light warm against the cold night. "Observe the fine details, Watson. These were taken in a photography studio. The chemicals and the precise retouching work point to a professional forger. This is no simple jealousy or theatre quarrel. It is part of a larger smuggling ring, fake Stradivarius instruments being passed off as genuine through the theatre's shipments." The man, a hired thug named Briggs, finally spoke under pressure, his voice rough. "Orlov paid me to watch the instruments and deliver the plates. Voss found out about the midnight handoffs. He threatened to expose everything, so Orlov pushed him into the pit. Stakes were raised dramatically when Briggs revealed there was a plan to sabotage the entire orchestra's instruments during the next performance, potentially injuring many and covering the smuggling operation. Another threat had already been sent to the troupe. Holmes's reasoning came as we rode back toward Baker Street in a rattling cab, the wheels splashing through puddles and the horses' hooves clopping steadily on the stone. The midnight violin was the coded signal for the handoff of the forged plates and instruments. Voss confronted Orlov or his agent after the performance. The scuff marks, the bow fragment, the wig hair, all fit. The precise damage to Langford's violin was meant to distract and test the security before the bigger swap. He referenced a past case briefly. "It reminds me of the smuggling operation on the Orient Express a few years ago, where valuable documents were hidden inside musical instrument cases. The forgers used similar photographic techniques to alter markings. The cases looked innocent, but the ground, the instruments themselves, betrayed the truth through tiny inconsistencies in weight, varnish, and labels. I admit I was thoroughly confused by the international angle at first. The involvement of foreign agents and large-scale forgery went far beyond the personal rivalries we had first suspected. I wonder if it escaped you as well, dear reader, or whether you saw the larger pattern sooner than I did." Resolution felt closer now as the pieces began to fall into place. The cold night air still clung to our clothes, smelling of the river as we planned our next moves. The orchestra's world of music and glamour had hidden a dangerous criminal enterprise, and the true killer was coming into focus. The pursuit had brought us dangerous evidence, but the final confrontation was still ahead. Chapter 6. The Past Speaks. The following day brought clearer skies, but a sharper chill that made the cobblestones ring under our boots. Holmes and I spent the morning delving into the criminal backgrounds of our suspects, moving between Scotland Yard records and discreet interviews. The air in the Yard's archive room smelled of old paper, dust, and the faint metallic tang of ink, while the files felt dry and brittle under our fingers. Orlov, it emerged. Our man was no true count at all. His real name was Dmitry Orlovsky, a known agent connected to a network of art forgers operating between St. Petersburg and London. Official telegrams and witness statements revealed he had been expelled from several European conservatories years earlier for dealing in counterfeit instruments. His soft hands, so carefully manicured, had never touched a bow in honest practice. Instead, they had handled forged labels and photographic plates. Motive became painfully clear as we pieced together the financial trail. Voss had discovered the smuggling scheme quite by accident. During a late rehearsal, he had noticed unusual weight in several instrument cases being prepared for export. Confronting Orlov privately after the performance, the conductor had threatened to expose the entire operation to the authorities and the theatre management. The midnight violin phrase in the note was the prearranged signal for the handoff of the latest batch of forged Stradivarius copies and the altered photographic negatives. Connections formed rapidly once we visited a small photography studio in Soho. The owner, a nervous little man with chemical-stained fingers, broke down under Holmes's questioning. The air inside was sharp with the acrid smell of developing fluids and fixer, the trays cool and slippery to the touch. He admitted that Orlov had commissioned dozens of plates showing genuine instruments being restored, while in reality, the labels were being swapped. And Langford's Stradivarius had been targeted first as a test, its precise damage designed to look like vandalism, while actually weakening it for an easy substitution. Watson reflected on the human cost as we walked back through the crowded streets. The glittering world of the theatre, with its perfume, grease paint, and soaring music, had concealed something far uglier. Greed that cared nothing for art or the lives it destroyed. Madame Rossi's broken affair, Reed's frustrated ambition, and Crow's gambling debts had all served as convenient smokescreens, diverting attention from the real crime. Even poor old Jenkins had been used as a minor distraction, his grumbled threats amplified to hide the larger conspiracy. The signs were there from the beginning, hidden in plain sight amid the music and the fog. The reddish mud on certain cuffs that matched the dockside warehouses rather than Mayfair drawing rooms. The faint chemical odor clinging to Orlov's gloves despite his claims of patronage. The broken watch stopped precisely at the moment of the handoff. In hindsight, we should have known. The midnight violin was never about a single smashed instrument or a jealous rival. It was the key to a lucrative international forgery ring that used the theatre as its perfect cover. Holmes paced our sitting room that evening, the familiar floorboards creaking softly beneath his feet while the fire cast a warm glow against the growing darkness outside. The scent of his strong shag tobacco filled the room, mixing with the lingering taste of Mrs. Hudson's hearty beef stew still on my tongue. "Everything points to Orlov as the man who pushed Voss," Holmes said quietly, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "The hired thug, Briggs, was merely the muscle. Orlov needed Voss silenced before the conductor could alert the police. The bow fragment, the wig hair, the precise timing, all fit his cold, calculating nature. Setup for resolution was now complete. We had the photographic evidence, the confession from the studio owner, and Briggs's testimony. Lestrade had been summoned and was preparing warrants. The orchestra would perform one final time under police watch, and Orlov would be taken the moment he attempted to complete the latest shipment. The past had spoken clearly at last. What had begun as a baffling theatre tragedy had revealed itself as a carefully orchestrated crime blending greed, forgery, and murder. The pieces connected into a dark but coherent picture, and the final act was about to begin. Chapter 7. The truth emerges. The Imperial Theatre stood hushed that evening, its gas lights burning low and casting long shadows across the gilded auditorium. Only the principal members of the orchestra and a handful of police officers were present. The air carried the familiar mingled scents of rosa, wilting flowers, and fresh stage paint, while the wooden boards felt cool and slightly sticky underfoot. A single violin played softly from the pit, a melancholy tune that seemed to echo the tension in the room. Orlov arrived precisely at 9, elegant in his fur-trimmed coat, carrying a small leather case. He paused when he saw Holmes and Lestrade waiting near the orchestra pit. His smooth face tightened, but he recovered quickly. Gentlemen," he said with forced calm, "is there some problem with tonight's private rehearsal?" Holmes stepped forward, his voice quiet yet commanding. "The rehearsal is cancelled, Count. Or should I say, Mr. Orlovsky. The only performance left is yours." Orlov's eyes narrowed. "I do not understand." "Then allow me to make it plain," Holmes replied. He gestured to the pit steps. "Observe the scuff marks, still visible even after cleaning. They show a violent push, not a simple fall. Voss confronted you here after the performance. He had discovered your scheme. The forged Stradivarius instruments being smuggled through the theatre's shipments, the photographic plates, altering labels, the entire forgery ring, operating under the cover of legitimate concerts." Madame Rossi gasped, her silk gown rustling as she clutched Reed's arm. Incro shifted uncomfortably, his waistcoat suddenly too tight. Langford stood pale but steady, his repaired violin resting on a nearby chair. Holmes continued through natural dialogue, pointing out at each piece of evidence. "The mother-of-pearl fragment from your inlaid bow was embedded in the wood where Voss fell. The dark hair, caught on the splinter, came from the wig you wore that night to disguise yourself as a stagehand. The precise crack in Langford's violin was not random vandalism. It was a test to see if the instrument could be swapped undetected. The midnight violin was your code for the handoff of the latest batch of fakes and negatives." Orlov's hands clenched at his sides. "You have no proof." "On the contrary," Holmes said calmly, "we have the negatives recovered from your hired man Briggs at the docks. We have the confession of the Soho photographer whose studio still reeks of the chemicals used on those plates. We have Briggs's statement that you personally pushed Voss when he threatened to expose you. The mud on your boots that night carried the unique mixture of dockside tar and theatre resin, a combination found nowhere else." I watched Orlov's face change as the truth settled upon him. The elegant mask cracked, revealing cold calculation beneath. "You see, Holmes went on, Voss was no fool. He noticed the unusual weight in the instrument cases and the fresh varnish that smelled slightly different. When he challenged you privately, after the audience left, you could not risk exposure. A single push in the darkened pit, a staged fall, and the orchestra would mourn an unfortunate accident. Yet the smashed violin was meant to point suspicion toward jealous rivals. Reed's ambition, Rossi's anger, Crow's debts, while you completed your profitable scheme." Rossi's voice trembled. "All those beautiful instruments, fakes, many of them," Holmes confirmed, "sold at high prices to wealthy patrons across Europe. The theatre provided perfect cover, regular shipments, respected names, and late-night access. Voss's death was simply the price of protecting the enterprise." Lestrade stepped forward with handcuffs, the metal clicking coldly. "Dmitry Orlovsky, I am arresting you for the murder of Elias Voss and for conspiracy to defraud." Orlov's reaction was icy defiance at first. "You English detectives are so provincial. This is bigger than one conductor. There are powerful interests behind me." "Perhaps," Holmes replied, "but they will not save you tonight. The game is over." Reactions rippled through the small gathering. Langford closed his eyes in relief, his fingers gently touching the restored Stradivarius. Reed looked stunned, then ashamed of his earlier suspicions. Crow mopped his brow, muttering about ruined finances, but clear of murder. Even old Jenkins, brought in as a witness, nodded slowly, his rough hands twisting his cap. Justice began its slow turn as two constables led Orlov away. The Russian's shoulders remained straight, but his step had lost its confident spring. Outside, the night air felt colder, carrying the distant rumble of carriages and the low moan of a foghorn from the river. Holmes saw the truth immediately, that night, in the theatre. I wonder how many of you saw it too, dear reader. Yet as the evidence slowly accumulated, the bow fragment, the chemical traces, the coded note, the dockside mud, nothing in my experience prepared me for the full darkness of this case, how a world of soaring music and apparent beauty could conceal such calculated greed and casual violence. As the theatre lights dimmed behind us and we stepped into the waiting hansom, the horse's breath steamed in the chill. Holmes turned to me with quiet satisfaction. "The melody has ended, Watson," he said softly, "and justice at last plays the final note." Chapter 8. Justice dawn broke cold and grey over London as the arrest unfolded. Orlov was taken from his hotel near Piccadilly in the early morning light, the air sharp with frost and the faint scent of coal smoke from waking chimneys. 2 constables flanked him as he descended the stairs. See his fur-trimmed coat, now looking less elegant in the harsh daylight. His boots clicked on the marble floor, a sound that echoed coldly through the quiet lobby. Lestrade supervised the proceedings with grim satisfaction. "Dmitry Orlovsky, you are charged with the murder of Maestro Elias Voss and with running a conspiracy to forge and smuggle counterfeit musical instruments. Anything you say will be noted." Orlov's response was one of icy defiance, mixed with contempt. He stood straight, his voice smooth but edged with bitterness. "You think you have won, Inspector. This is merely a temporary inconvenience. Powerful friends in St. Petersburg and Berlin will not allow a minor theatre scandal to ruin years of careful work." Holmes stood nearby, observing quietly, his expression calm. "Your powerful friends may find it difficult to explain their involvement once the photographic plates and forged labels are presented in court. The evidence is overwhelming. The bow fragment, the wig hair, the dockside mud on your boots, and Briggs's full confession. Greed led you to push Voss to his death when he threatened to expose the entire ring." The criminal's face twisted for a moment, revealing the man beneath the polished exterior. Voss was a fool. He could have been bought. Instead, he chose righteousness. One push in the dark pit, and the problem was solved. The smashed violin was a perfect distraction, pointing suspicion at jealous musicians while we completed the latest shipment. Questions were answered in the hours that followed at Scotland Yard, in a small, stuffy interview room, smelling of stale tobacco and strong tea. Orlov finally spoke more freely once he realized escape was impossible. The scheme had been simple, yet lucrative. Genuine old instruments were restored in London, their labels carefully altered using photographic techniques, then shipped abroad as authentic Stradivarius or Guarneri pieces. The Imperial Theatre provided perfect cover, regular international shipments, respected names, and access after hours. Voss had stumbled upon the truth when he noticed the unusual weight and fresh varnish on several cases. Crowe, the manager, sat pale and shaken in an adjacent room. "I suspected something was wrong with the finances," he admitted, his voice trembling as he sipped hot tea, the liquid warming his hands. "Large payments from foreign buyers. But Voss kept pushing for higher orchestra salaries. I never imagined murder." Madame Rossi wept quietly when informed, her perfume still clinging to her shawl. All those performances, the music we created together, tainted by such ugliness. Reed looked ashamed, realizing how his own ambition had made him an easy suspect. Langford, holding his restored Stradivarius, simply nodded with quiet relief, the wood gleaming warmly under the gaslight. Impact on others unfolded gradually throughout the day. The theatre troupe gathered in the green room, the air heavy with the scent of coffee and nervous sweat. Many expressed sorrow for Voss, a strict but dedicated conductor who had died protecting the integrity of their art. Old Jenkins, cleared completely, received back pay and an apology from Crowe, in his rough hands twisting his cap in awkward gratitude. By afternoon, the newspapers carried the first reports. The cold print on rough paper told of a sensational arrest in the theatrical world and hinted at an international forgery ring. Innocent lives were beginning to mend. Langford would perform again with his beloved instrument, now properly repaired by a trusted luthier. Rossi was offered the lead role she had long desired. Reed gained the solo opportunities he had earned through talent rather than resentment. As evening approached, Holmes and I returned to Baker Street. The sitting room felt warm and familiar, the fire crackling against the chill outside. The scent of Mrs. Hudson's roast beef drifted up the stairs, rich and comforting. Holmes lit his pipe, the tobacco smoke curling blue in the lamplight. Baythand stretched his long legs toward the hearth. "Consequences are rarely simple, Watson," he said thoughtfully. "Orlov's greed destroyed one life and nearly ruined many others. Yet justice has begun its work. The forged instruments will be seized, the ring disrupted, and the theatre can return to its proper purpose, creating beauty rather than concealing crime." I nodded, still reflecting on the day's events. Nothing in my long association with Holmes had prepared me for the full consequences of this case, how a single push in a darkened orchestra pit could ripple outward, affecting the lives of artists, managers, and even distant buyers who had paid fortunes for false masterpieces. The arrest and its aftermath marked the beginning of restoration. Orlov would face trial, his elegant mask stripped away to reveal the calculating criminal beneath. The orchestra would play again, but with a new awareness of the shadows that sometimes lurk behind the music. Justice, though imperfect, had begun to unfold, bringing a measure of order back to the world of the midnight violin. Chapter 9. Restoration. The weeks that followed the arrest brought a measured return to order in the world, touched by the midnight violin. The trial at the Old Bailey was brisk but thorough, held in a wood-panelled courtroom that smelled of polished oak, old paper, and the faint mustiness of legal robes. Orlov, now stripped of his title and finery, sat in the dock with a face like stone. The evidence presented was damning. The photographic negatives with their sharp chemical scent still lingering on the plates. The bow fragment, carefully mounted as an exhibit, the mud-stained boots, and Briggs's sworn testimony. The jury needed little time to convict him of murder and conspiracy to defraud. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, his elegant mask finally shattered. Langford's innocence was fully and publicly cleared. In the corridor outside the court, he stood holding his restored Stradivarius, the wood gleaming with fresh polish under the pale autumn light filtering through high windows. The luthier had worked wonders. The long crack was invisible. The bridge strong and true once more. "It sings again, Doctor," he told me quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "Thanks to Mr. Holmes. I thought my career ended that terrible night." Madame Rossi took the lead role in the new opera, as promised. We attended the opening night at the Imperial, and where her voice soared pure and powerful above the orchestra. The theatre smelled once more of grease paint, fresh flowers and anticipation, rather than fear. After the final curtain, she sought us out in the green room, her silk gown rustling softly, perfume light and floral. "The music feels clean again," she said simply, pressing Holmes's hand. Voss would have been pleased. Young Thomas Reed gained the solo passages he had long deserved. His playing during the performance showed new maturity and fire, the notes ringing clear and confident. He approached Holmes afterward, his hands still trembling slightly from the exertion. "I was a fool to let jealousy blind me. Thank you for seeing the truth." Silas Crowe, though shaken by the scandal, managed to keep the theatre afloat. His gambling debts were settled through discreet arrangements, and the publicity, strangely, brought larger audiences, eager to see the scene of the famous case. The ledgers in his office now showed healthier figures, the paper crisp and the ink fresh. Old Jenkins received not only his back wages, but a small promotion to assistant stage manager. We visited him in the theatre workshop one afternoon. where the air smelled of sawdust and fresh varnish. His rough, calloused hands moved with surprising gentleness over a new set piece. "Never thought I'd see the day," he muttered gruffly. "The old maestro can rest easy now." Futures began to unfold more brightly for all involved. The orchestra rehearsed with renewed energy, the scrapes of bows and warm tones of strings filling the hall. International shipments of genuine instruments resumed under careful scrutiny, and the forgery ring's remaining threads were steadily unraveled by police across Europe. Normalcy slowly returned to Baker Street as well. Our sitting room, once again, hosted quiet evenings, with the crackle of the fire, the rich aroma of Holmes's shag tobacco, and the occasional melancholy strains of his violin. Mrs. Hudson's meals tasted comforting and familiar. Hearty stews with the savory depth of herbs, followed by simple puddings. The chill of autumn deepened outside, but inside 221B the temperature remained pleasantly warm, a refuge from the city's fog and noise. Looking back on the case, I find myself reflecting on how easily beauty can be corrupted by greed. The glittering world of music and theatre had hidden darkness, yet justice and truth had prevailed. The signs had been there from the start. The precise damage to the violin, the coded note, the unusual mud, the chemical traces, hidden in plain sight amid the glamour and rivalry. In hindsight, the pattern was clear, though I confess it took me longer than it should have to see it. The restoration was nearly complete. The innocent walked free with brighter prospects, the guilty faced punishment, and the orchestra prepared for a new season, untainted by crime. Order had been restored to the midnight violin's melody, allowing music to rise once more, pure and unshadowed. Chapter 10. Baker Street Reflections. A quiet evening had settled over 221B Baker Street. The fire burned steadily in the grate, casting a warm golden glow across the familiar sitting room and pushing back the autumn chill that pressed against the windows. The air carried the comforting scent of Holmes's favourite shag tobacco, mingling with the faint aroma of Mrs. Hudson's lamb chops and rosemary from our recent supper. Outside, the distant rumble of carriage wheels and the occasional chime of church bells drifted up through the fog, softened and muffled. Holmes lounged in his armchair, long legs stretched toward the hearth, while I sat opposite with a glass of good brandy. The rich, warming liquid carried a smooth oak taste that lingered pleasantly on the tongue. His violin rested on the table beside him, the polished wood gleaming softly in the firelight. "The papers this morning gave a fair summary," I remarked, setting down the evening edition. The newsprint felt crisp between my fingers. "Orlov has been transferred to Pentonville. The forgery ring is being dismantled across 3 countries. The Imperial Theatre announces a special memorial concert for Voss next month." Holmes nodded, his eyes half closed in contentment. "A fitting end. Music should remember its own, Watson, not the shadows that tried to corrupt it." We spoke at length of the case, the brandy glasses clinking softly as we refilled them. Holmes recounted how the precise angle of the crack in the Stradivarius had first told him the damage was deliberate, rather than passionate. I admitted my initial bewilderment at the international threads, the photographic negatives, the dockside meetings, the false counts, polished lies. The warmth of the room contrasted sharply with the cold, damp nights we had spent pursuing leads along the Thames warehouses, where the air had reeked of tar and river mud. "Looking back," Holmes said, drawing on his pipe, the smoke curling lazily upward, "the ground gave us the clearest story. Mud on cuffs, resin on gloves, the unique weight of those instrument cases. Each detail spoke when properly questioned. Voss died because he refused to stay silent, a single, principled stand in a world too often ruled by profit." I reflected on the transformations we had witnessed. Langford's Stradivarius now sang again in public performances, its voice richer for the ordeal. Madame Rossi's high notes rang with new emotional depth. Reed played with genuine confidence rather than resentment. Even Crow's ledgers showed healthier figures, and old Jenkins moved about the theatre with quiet pride in his new role. The guilty had been exposed and punished. The innocent walked forward unburdened. His broader thoughts turned to the city itself, London, with its glittering theatres, bustling docks, smoky factories, and fog-shrouded streets, hid countless such stories beneath its surface. Beauty and crime often walked side by side, music rising from the same halls where dark bargains were struck. Yet truth, pursued with patience and observation, could restore order. The case had reminded me once more of the thin line between light and shadow in our great metropolis. Holmes rose eventually and took up his violin. He played a gentle, triumphant air, not the melancholy strains of that first restless evening, but something brighter, resolving into clear, ringing notes that filled the room. The bow moved smoothly across the strings, the horsehair whispering softly. I closed my eyes, letting the music wash over me. In the warmth of the fire on my face and the brandy's glow within, as the final note faded, Holmes lowered the instrument and turned to me with a rare, quiet smile. "The melody has run its course, Watson. Another puzzle solved, another shadow lifted. To those who have followed this account through its many turns, from the fog-bound night the case first presented itself, through the shadowed streets and deeper waters, to the final restoration of order, I offer this closing thought: the midnight violin no longer carries a threat, but a reminder. Truth, like a pure note, will always emerge, however dark the hour in which it is played. Justice may arrive late, yet it arrives, and in the end, the music continues. The fire crackled softly. Outside, the city slept under its blanket of fog. Inside, 221B Baker Street, two friends sat in companionable silence. The case of the midnight violin closed at last, leaving only satisfaction and the promise of new adventures yet to come.